friends. Welcome to Conversations That Matter. My name is Brittany Butler.
And I'm Michelle Treese.
And we have some great guests for you today. Yes. So we'll get them to introduce themselves.
So, Kate, tell us something about you.
I will. I'm Katie Hoffman. You will find me where there is noise and music and collaboration. I'm the executive director of Create Appalachia, and I'm especially excited to be being interviewed with my friend Theresa. We have known each other forever, yes. Working on graduate school projects together and now doing arts, nonprofit stuff. And what a wonderful opportunity.
Yeah, love that. And Theresa, introduce yourself.
My name is Theresa Hammons. I'm the director of the McKinney Center here in Jonesborough, and been here for about 10 years. And we do all sorts of things from story collecting and storytelling to arts, music, dance, theater, visual arts. And like Katie said, we've known each other. I was thinking about it the other day, like when did we meet? And I was sort of adding up, okay, when did I graduate college? When was I in grad school? And I guess we met probably in 2002, sometime around there. So yeah, we've known each other for over 20 years.
That is great.
Wow.
We've been through some stuff together.
Yes, we have life stuff and career stuff.
Yes.
So, and our paths is sort of kind of parallel a little bit with starting in your English. Your English literature.
Right. My PhD's in English, but really Appalachian Studies. Yes. And Theresa was at Appalachian State doing her master's in the same thing, and we teamed up on some projects,
really
which was really cool.
Yeah.
Now, are y'all from this area originally, or where'd you grow up?
Well, I am originally from Southwest Virginia, and from Jonesville, Virginia, Lee County, and that's about an hour and a half away.
And I'm originally from Cumberland County, Virginia, but I usually just say Richmond because people know where that is, and that's where I went to school.
Yeah. And I was doing my graduate work. I was at Appalachian State University, and we all had to do internships. And so there's an internship opportunity in Sneedville, Tennessee, with the Vardy Community Historical Society. They were creating a little museum, and they are historically a community that had been labeled over a century as triracial. And so they have really an interesting history and folklore and all sorts of things, DNA projects going on. But it was really cool to go to that community. And that's where I met Katie, because you came in there to help.
Yes, funny story, I was taking a class called Documenting Community History at ETSU. And part of it was because I had tried to get an Appalachian College Association fellowship to work on my PhD. And they had 15 fellowships to give, and I ended up 16 on the list. And when I asked them why, they said it was because I hadn't started my PhD yet. So I thought, okay, I need to take a course. So I took a course called Documenting Community Traditions, and it was funded by the Kellogg Foundation. There were all these communities that were coming in, kind of campaigning to us graduate students to get them to help with their projects. And they were oral history projects, and I had experience with that. So I was pretty excited about it. Well, we had read a book about Melungeons, and at the time, this was a really hot topic, and there was a hot debate, and there were lots of feelings about what is or isn't Melungeon, And so I thought, I am staying away from that. I am not going to put a dog in that race at all. And when the community members came to talk about the Vardy Community School, they talked about this awesome school that it was a settlement school that the Presbyterians from up north set up, and they wanted somebody to interview the students who'd been to this school, and I signed myself right up, and then I found out that it was like ground zero for the whole Melungeon thing, and it turned out to be a fabulous thing. It turned out to be, working with that group was wonderful, and I learned a lot about people's perceptions of themselves and their communities and how they communicate that civilly with one another when they disagree. And it was a great experience. In fact, I worked on that for a semester, but I ended up doing 2 years worth of work on the project. So it was definitely something that caught my attention and my heart. And we did a lot of interviews, oral history interviews, and
great stories. Some really great stories.
Amazing stories, yeah.
Was that the first time, Theresa, that you had heard about the Melungeons?
No.
You'd heard about it before.
Yes, see, Sneedville, Tennessee, and Lee County, Virginia are right next to each other.
Oh.
And so my grandmother is from Hancock County, Tennessee. So I've always heard that term, so stereotypically, this is very stereotype of someone who is of Melungeon descent. Is they're dark-skinned, blue eyes. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they might have light, like blonde hair. And so I grew up with people around me in my community, school, church, that fit that description. And I never thought 2 cents about it. Never even gave it a thought, because that was common. Even my grandmother would talk about her mom. She would refer to her mother as being Cherokee. And she never identified herself as Native or Cherokee, but she always talked about her grandmother being Cherokee. And so it's always been something that I grew up with. So then I went to college and realized like it was a big deal. And I was like, what? So, but like Katie said, when the project came up to work with the community, when we got there, we saw that to them, race did not matter. It was about their families, their family connection, social issues, economic issues, and that church, the Presbyterian church that came in and built that school for them. And not just, it also provided their health care for the kids. It provided a lot of social activities and community building. And a lot of those, of course, they were adults when we were interviewing them and talking to them. They thrived and went on to have wonderful careers, and some of them stayed, some of them moved away. But it was all about how to capture the heritage and the history of that community. That's what they were trying to do.
And what was so inspiring about it was that the people who started the school, Miss Rankin came in first. She was a missionary lady who went in, and she was the first trained medical person they'd had in this community. Mm-hmm. And she was a midwife, and she had some basic medical training, and they kind of sent her out scouting to find the best place to put the school. And they chose this community because it was far enough away from Sneedville that these students couldn't walk to Sneedville to school, and they were too poor or too busy, like they couldn't spare horses and wagons to take them to Sneedville, right? So she scouted it out, and the Presbyterians sent Chester Leonard and his wife, and they set up this school. And the thing that fascinated me from the beginning, and why I got so interested as an educator, was that they were all about bringing everybody together and making it a community. So they started out by building a playground, and they made a deal with the adults in the community. Look, if you'll go cut the lumber and you'll give us the labor, we'll send all of the materials that you can't make here from New York, windows and doorknobs and all that kind of stuff, and we'll send them on the train. And they'd go over, I think, to Jonesborough to pick that stuff, or someplace across the mountain.
I think Pennington Gap.
Oh, that's right.
The train
Pennington
station
Gap.
was. Yeah.
In Pennington Gap. So it was this whole collaborative effort. And the reason that they built the playground first was that they wanted a place to bring people together. And they had programs that included the parents and the kids, because they wanted the parents to buy into the whole school thing. So it was really a remarkable model, and the way they educated them was almost Montessori-like. They had 4 classrooms, and they were sort of vaguely by grade, like a couple of grades in each, because it went to 8th grade.
I think so, yeah.
And if you were in 4th grade math, you would just go into the 4th grade classroom for math, and if you were in 3rd grade for reading, you just go. It was, and they also educated them. Chester Leonard said, "I want them to be able to thrive wherever they go, no matter what they do. If they stay in the valley here, I want them to thrive. If they leave, we want them to thrive." So along with all the academic things, they learned all kinds of things about carpentry and animal husbandry. And it was, I bet it was one of the first places around here to serve like hot lunches to the kids every day. And people in the community would pledge food from their gardens to support the school. And then of course they had it divided by gender because it was back then. But like all the girls learned to cook and sew, and they made the food that got served in the school.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a pretty inspiring kind of a place.
And I always found it fascinating. It was a little different of a model than the traditional settlement schools in Appalachia.
It was.
Because in settlement schools, the kids, they learned reading, writing, and arithmetic, but there's always a craft. It was always very craft-based, and teaching them a craft so then possibly they could sell the craft or raise money for the school for crafts or with crafts. But in Vardy, that was not a component. It was much more preparing children for higher education and giving them those life skills, again, to live there in the community.
Yeah.
Okay, so first of all, I've heard about the Melungeons, but this is the most I have ever learned. I am sitting here, my brain is overflowing. I mean, I've heard about them. Yeah. And I've always wondered, who are they? Like, I'm from Morristown, which is maybe an hour and a half away from there.
Yeah.
Never, ever have I heard all of this. So this is amazing for me.
I hadn't either. And this was the part that I was happy, that makes me happy that I signed up for that project, not knowing what I was signing up for, because there's such a sense of community among them. And you ask who Melungeons are, all people can do is give you their personal opinions.
Right.
And my personal opinion is that it doesn't really have to do with ethnicity. I think Theresa and I both have agreed on that for years. It has to do with the fact that this was a group of people who got othered because they lived out from any towns. And because they had this tendency to take people in without, I mean, there were blacks up above Vardy. There was a black community. There was probably intermarriage. There was definitely Cherokee blood in a lot of the families. And what I found so fascinating was, you think there's this whole big, myth that Appalachia was so isolated. And that community was in this big flat valley that before trains, planes, and automobiles was like the logical way to go out west. So you had lots of traffic coming through that valley and lots of people coming in. And it was funny to hear them talk about how people came in from outside a number of ways. Like, remember they talked about Mr. Gross, who, is it Grow or it was Gross, who ran the grocery store, and his mother still had a German accent, right? And there were families who would go to the orphanages and adopt children and bring them into the community, partly because they needed people to help on the farm and their kids were aging out. And so it was not as isolated as everybody romanticizes it to be. Don't you think?
I absolutely agree. And we got a lot of stories of people who talked about the train. They would travel by train places, or there was a family that talked about floating logs down the Clinch River all the way down to Mississippi
on the spring floods. They would ride the logs
and then bring the train back home. So I mean, they were traveling. They traveled places. They went places, and of course, the World War I and World War II took people different places, and so they came back home with all kinds of experiences, and
Yeah.
so it was fascinating to be in that community and to really hear the personal stories and get past all of that, the bias and the generalizations. And you can get on Google and just Google Melungeon, and you come up with you see all the theories of how this community formed, and they have their own theories. Like, once you start talking to them, they would start sort of giving you their theories on who they are and where they came from. And some of them were very interested in their DNA, and they actually had testing done. But for the most part, I found like it kind of bothered them that you just brought it up. Like, that's not why we're together. That's not our mission. That's not important. It wasn't important in their community. Now, and I will say they did have conversations, and they talked about how they kind of categorized each other. And there were issues. I had a lady tell me about, in her family Bible, her mother erased a last name that was stereotypically a black community or a black family, and wrote another name. And if they had, I remember a lady telling me that she was more fair skinned, and so she then was able to go on to high school. But her siblings were kept at home so that no one would find out. So, and we're talking about probably the 40s and 50s. So that's not that long ago. So things like that did happen. And then there's a lot of economic issues that probably was probably more dividing in the community than the race issue. I had a lady talk about how her mom and dad would take them to Knoxville to go do things or go on vacation, and they would tell their kids, don't tell the kids at school that we're doing this. Don't tell the other kids that, because they didn't want to be, I don't know, categorized as above their means or growing, what's that old saying, don't get above your raisin sort of thing.
Keeping up with the Joneses, so don't let them know that we might be the Joneses.
Yeah.
So, tri-race, what are those three? Is that
White, Cherokee mostly, and black.
and black?
Yeah. And part of the problem was this guy who was the medical examiner of the state of Virginia.
Yep.
His name was William Plecker, and he was a dreadful person.
Just read his writings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he had this law against miscegenation, right? Like, one drop of blood and a white person couldn't marry somebody of another race. And he was particularly interested in, and not in a good way, in the Melungeons and who they were. So that's a whole big thing.
It scared people, and so that's why they would hide or not talk about their family or whatever, because they didn't want their rights to be taken away. They couldn't vote, couldn't.
Remember the Life magazine article? There were a lot of mixed feelings about this one Life magazine article that somebody, journalists came in and took pictures in the community, and some of them were happy that they were interesting to people. Others of them were really offended because the word Melungeon back then was a slur.
Yeah.
And I was told, when they sent me into the community, they said, don't bring that word up. So I was like, okay, I'm not going to talk about it. That's fine with me, because remember how I started with this whole thing. I was like, oh, no problem. You want to hear? But they brought it up to me.
Yep.
They would, have you heard that we're Melungeons? And I'd say, yes. What does that mean? And Teresa's right. Like, you ask 5 different people, and you're going to get 5 slightly different answers. Yep. And one woman told me this story. This was one of my favorite stories. She was over in Southwest Virginia. I can't remember her first name, but her last name was Gibson. And she told me about her father-in-law, Asa Gibson, who was a horse and mule whisperer. He had this amazing touch with the horses and the mules. And she said his mother was taken out to Oklahoma on the Trail of Tears while she was pregnant with him, I think.
Oh, I remember the story.
And she got out there and she talked so much about Vardy as home, because Oklahoma definitely didn't feel like that. He walked back from Oklahoma to Vardy and became part of the community there. And his jobs in the community, the job that he sort of made a living by was breaking horses and mules, but everybody also had kind of a community service job that they did, and his was sighting the graves so that on the judgment day everybody be facing the right way. And she talked about him. The stories, she clearly idolized him and just adored him, and she said, he was a wonderful person. And that story really touched me, just thinking about this mother going out there and that sense of community. Later, I saw in another context when Seven Gibson, who was a preacher from Vardy, was standing there with me at one of the Vardy at one of the Melungeon unions, actually, which was a reunion of Melungeons that happens, and they're still doing them.
Yeah.
And I was speaking about some of the things that I had done, and I was standing there talking to this guy, and he said, "You see that tent over there?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "That tent belongs to me. You want to know why I bought it?" I said, "I'm dead curious why you bought it." And he said, "I bought it because I got tired of burying people I didn't know." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, I live up in Baltimore, Ellicott City. And he said, there's a whole little community up there called Little Hancock of all these people who live up there together, and they have, like, their children have never lived in Vardy, but everybody sees Vardy as home. And he said, they want to come here and get buried. So he said, every year I take that tent and I go up to Ellicott City and I hold a revival and I get to know them all. So when I bring them home to bury them, I have something to say. Wow. And I was like, wow.
Yeah.
That's how much they cared about that.
Yeah.
Yep. It's really inspiring. And it's not like they didn't have problems or squabbles or whatever. But they certainly, it was kind of like siblings, like, I can pick on her, but if you pick on her, you have to answer to me, right? They're kind of like that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And they were proud of the education they got in that school.
Very proud. They talked about the pastor bringing Berea College in, and the Berea would bring presentations and films and projects and programs, and they remembered all of that stuff. It was really fascinating how they talked about how when they got to high school they were, a step above, educationally, the kids that were there. And a lot of them went on to college. Lots of them went on to college and had great careers. And the group that we worked with in particular, the board, the historical board, society's board, several of them did lived in Ohio and some other places, and they would come every month, because I think we met monthly, and be a part of the board. And the funny thing is, when they started their renovation project or their historical society, they started with the church. That's the first building that they renovated, and that's the first place they put artifacts. The school, unfortunately, was too far gone. But the second project is they brought the cabin down from Newman's Ridge. So this cabin originally was owned by Mahala Mullins, who is probably the most famous Melungeon. And they brought her cabin down and restored it. And so now it's there, it's open. They have events through the summer. They even have musical, like picking on the porch kind of things on the weekends. And so now it's sort of a tourist attraction. Being the Melungeon heritage helps bring people to the community to inspire the tourism. So Mahala was known to be 600 pounds. She was a moonshiner, and the story is she was catchable but not fetchable. And that was in the arrest report.
Oh my gosh.
She was catchable but not fetchable because they couldn't get her out of the cabin. And the story
She wouldn't fit out the door.
She wouldn't fit out the door. And so when she passed away, they actually had to remove the chimney of the cabin. And they buried, from what I understand, they buried her close to the cabin. So, but now they've moved it down into the valley across the street from the church. And it's beautiful.
That cabin is also evidence of the fact that they went other places and saw other things.
Yep.
Because the first thing you notice about that cabin when you go is these beautiful arched windows.
Yeah.
And they went somewhere and got that idea
You
and
don't-
came back and did it.
Yeah, you do not see that in other places in Appalachia.
I mean, somebody
Windows are
like,
not.
I don't know how they bent that wood, but they steamed it or I don't know how they did it.
And they just added that to make it look really cool?
Yeah.
Or, okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Do you know if you mentioned some folks might have done a DNA test or something?
Yeah.
Has it kind of come? Do you have any idea if it's kind of come back confirming the triracial?
I was present the day that Brent Kennedy, who wrote several books.
We were both there.
Were you there too?
We were both there.
So we were there. So let me tell you the end first, and then I'll back up because it's kind of interesting. So the results of the DNA testing were inconclusive.
Right.
Oh my goodness.
Shocking.
Shocking.
Yeah.
So here's how the DNA was collected, which a lot of people do not know this part. But I was there. I saw it with my own eyes.
No, people need to know this, and I'll
People
back
need
her
to know
up.
this.
I know exactly what she's about to tell you.
Brent Kennedy, who was he was a professor. Was he a professor?
Mm-mm.
I can't remember what his career was, but he was of Melungeon descent, and not from that community, from another community. And he wrote several books about Melungeons and his theory. And he shows up at one of our board meetings with Ziploc bags
And a pair of tweezers.
and a pair of tweezers and asks everyone for a sample of their hair. And he collected hair samples from everyone, including me. And I said, well, I'm not from this community. And he told me, he said, the words that came out of his mouth were, you will never be able to do a DNA test ever for free. So you should take advantage of this, and you'll get your sample, your results back. And so I was like, okay, that's kind of cool. Well, he took my sample. He wrote your name on the baggie, and we never heard from him again.
Meanwhile, I'm sitting there thinking, this doesn't look very scientific to me. This is pretty sketchy science.
Sippy bag right there.
And he also made some announcement about there's some big grant funder that wants to give you all this money, and I, being me, raised my hand and said, who is it? Because I don't know about y'all, but if somebody's going to give me money, I want to know who they are and what strings are attached and whatever. And he said, well, I can't talk about that right now.
Yeah.
And I thought, ooh, I have some questions. Questions.
And before Mr. Kennedy's passed away, but before he passed away, I called him twice personally and asked for my results. And both times he like just talked around it and never gave me my results. So I don't know. We say that for what it's worth. I don't know, but
read the book and decide yourself.
Yeah,
right?
read the books and decide yourself.
What is that book? What was his name again?
Where are the names?
Brent, Brent Kennedy, and it's called The Melungeons. Something about, I can't remember. It has genocide in the subtitle, which when I had lunch with him, he was like, I understand that you had questions about my book. And he said, yes. And or I said, yes. And he said, well, what were they? And I said, well, let's start with the title. Genocide seems like an awfully strong word. And because genocide has certain connotations that for everything that was bad that was happening in Vardy or that people claimed happened in Vardy, there wasn't murder really and mayhem the way that there is in like Africa and other parts of the world, right? So, It's a book that everybody ought to read. And the thing that he did do was he put all these theories in there about who the Melungeons were, and he got the conversation started.
He did.
So, you need conversation starters. And I think he was a really nice guy, and he was like really enthusiastic about all of it. He was just a little hard to pin down on the actual substantive details.
I think intentions were well-meaning, and then of course advice for anyone who's looking into stuff like this is when you read a book, look at the sources. Just make sure you check your sources.
And if there aren't sources, have questions about that too.
I just envision there's a Theresa clone running out somewhere. Everyone at that meeting has a clone now.
Oh yeah, you just never know.
Well, the world could do worse than to have two Theresas. I mean,
Well, it was really an interesting experience.
It was.
Yeah.
So, 2 questions. This was 20 years ago?
Yeah.
Look at how much detail you guys have in this.
Oh, well, I mean,
Like, that is amazing.
After talking to Seven Gibson, I went up to Ellicott City and spent a week interviewing people who lived up there because I was curious about the whole phenomenon that he had described.
And what is that?
He's the guy who said he got tired of burying people he didn't know, so he went up to Maryland to this community. So I went up there to Little Hancock and met all these people and interviewed them. And, like I said, it was supposed to be a semester-long project, and it ended up being 2 years.
Wow.
And I had never had apple stack cake. And I went up there for these interviews, and people from down here were telling me, "Oh, I'd be afraid to go up there," all this kind of stuff. I'll use the radio word stuff. And I went up there to do interviews, and I bet you had the same experience. You would walk in, and they would have made something special. I mean, if you've ever made an apple stack cake, it's not like you have to plan ahead. You don't make it that morning and serve it that evening. People would make special things, and I was like a guest of honor. And I don't care how poor they were or how wealthy they were. It was a code of honor that they treated you with hospitality. And I must have collected 6 apple stack cake recipes along the way. I mean, because these people were so generous, and they made us part of the community.
Oh, yeah,
they
absolutely.
included us in conversations, and they asked what they thought. And it was a really wonderful experience. I think that's why I remember it in such detail, because I was really steeped in it. Probably more than when I did my dissertation work.
Yeah. And I was in my early 20s. I mean, I was just in graduate school. So I went to school a little earlier than most. So I was probably 21, 22. So I was just a baby. And I was looking back, I'm really impressed how much they told me. Here's this kid asking them all these questions, and they just gifted me with all of this information and stories, and shared things that they hadn't shared with anyone else for a very long time other than each other. And so I've always felt very privileged to be a part of that. And I'd always and I guess that's what started me just really interested in different groups in Appalachia, and looking at those groups and where did they come from. And so after my graduate work in Barty, I was very, very fortunate to get an internship at the Smithsonian, the American Indian Museum, just when it was being formed. It wasn't even built yet, so I was there through that process.
Who knew?
You didn't know that?
No.
Yes, so I worked at the American Indian Museum. And so in my spare time, when I wasn't working on exhibits, I was looking at maps. I was looking at maps of Spanish forts, and stories of history of where Spanish soldiers possibly were left or other explorers that sort of went through Appalachia.
Because that's part of the theory about
Yeah.
who the Melungeons
Yeah.
are.
Okay.
And I started looking at maps and sort of overlaying those maps with maps of the eastern United States, southeastern United States, and all of these triracial groups that are in the southeast, and looking at the proximity. And I think, just this is my personal opinion, I have nothing to back it up. I think there's something there. I think there could be something there, along with the fact that people intermarried with Cherokee. And when you look at Cherokee history and their traditions, they were a very community oriented. They intermarried with a lot of different tribes and settlers, and I think it was just sort of a natural thing that happened. And if you look at the land geographically, it was, if you've ever been to Hancock County, you know how hard it is to get there, and there's just all these little valleys and hollers. And I think people who did intermarry created their safe spaces, and they knew that they could live and thrive. And Vardy Valley is very rich. The soil through there is amazing, and so they were very successful growing crops and having livestock and things like that.
And there was also another element to the isolation myth. Around the Civil War era, there was also a hotel there where you could go and take the cure, because they had like the sulfur springs or the hot springs, and so that brought people in and out of that area too. So, but yeah, it's one of the most beautiful places I've ever been in my life. Like I could feel my blood pressure go down just driving up those mountains and looking at all that beautiful scenery.
When's the last time you guys have been there?
I was just there a few weeks ago, because I have, my parents are still in Lee County, and we go over there quite a lot. So,
and does it still look the same? Not big Walmarts and Dollar Generals everywhere?
Not in Hancock County and Lee County. There's not a lot of difference.
So it's still pretty much the same.
Yeah.
So when you mentioned earlier, they darker skin, blue eyes, dark hair, some blonde hair. When we talk skin color, is it mocha brown? Is it caramel? Is it like brown sugar brown? Like, what's the it's all of the above.
Well, there's different degrees,
Yeah.
really, but I think of Troy and how he, almost like a, I even hate to characterize,
Go for it,
but
we black. I'm black.
almost like a Mediterranean kind of brown, or if you went to Cherokee, North Carolina, you would see that just nice, that brown, that's sort of
like a red brown, and then some of them were as white as I am, right?
Yeah. And so and blonde hair,
blonde hair, blue eyes, and you would never have pegged them as stereotypical. Like you wouldn't see them walking down the street and go, "Oh, there goes a Melungeon." Right?
I used to tell people, my grandmother, I always knew her as having white hair on top, and she was very dark skinned. But if you pulled her hair up in the back, it was black as it could be. And I would tell people, like, she could be in a Sicilian pizza commercial. Like, really, that's sort of how that's how I generalized how she looked. But now my grandfather, who was from Lee County, he was pale, white, freckles, red hair, and blue eyes. So, it was very different.
I know. And, but I see, I've always had an interest in them. And I know Wayne Winkler.
Yeah.
I thought was the king, but sorry, Wayne. We got two queens.
Now Wayne, here, let me tell you about Wayne. Wayne is awesome because Wayne entertains all opinions and respects all opinions and creates community between all the people who are interested in Melungeons, even if they don't agree with each other. And he invited me one time. This was kind of surreal. Mark O'Connor, Mark O'Connor, the fiddle player, and Twyla Tharp, the dance. She's like the modern dance queen or something. They were considering doing a piece together, a dance piece with music about the Melungeons. And so they were gonna they went up to Vardy, and Wayne invited me to go. So here I am sitting there with Twyla Tharp and Mark O'Connor, and Wayne is remarkable. I mean, he's just,
He really is.
Yeah.
he's really remarkable in his capacity to include everybody in the conversation. I would argue that he is the king of,
Yeah.
the whole
He's got
thing.
2 queens with him
Well,
right now.
and as far as the
We're just princesses.
I can handle that. I can do that. And as far as the books about Melungeons go, I would probably steer people toward his book to read, and it's a lot of personal story with that as well.
Right.
So
Is this
personal
an
opinion.
NPR Wayne Wing?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Soul Kitchen Wayne Wing.
Oh, wow.
You know him? Oh, you know.
I know the name. I listen
Oh,
to NPR. but
he's just definitely worth knowing.
And there's a play. You reminded me of the play Walking Toward the Sunset, right?
Yeah.
Which Sneedville did years ago. They don't do it now, but it's a play all about the Melungeons. And
Well, now I got to see the play because several years ago, Walter State does a Mildred Hahn conference. And if you've never read Mildred Hahn's book, I'm sorry, but I did my dissertation on Appalachian literature on somebody else. Mildred Hahn's book, The Hawk's Done Gone and Other Stories, is just flat out the best damn book you'll ever read. And it was ahead of its time. And it deals with the Melungeon, like the whole race thing.
What's the name again?
It's called The Hawk's Done Gone and Other Stories, and it is so powerful. But there's a Mildred Hahn conference at Walter State, and one year they had a production of Walk Toward the Sunset, and Clyde and Druanna and all of those people came. The people that we had worked with and interviewed and talked to, they were all there, and they were so excited, and they did the play.
yeah,
What's
So-
Joanna's last name?
Overbay.
Okay. That's somebody else.
and she's written a book.
Yeah.
Yeah, Joanna
Yeah.
Overbay has written a book.
So, I mean, and there's like some of the interviews I did are in that Kellogg grant, but then a bunch of the interviews I did are in a collection at the Archives of Appalachia in my name. So if anybody wants to go listen to them,
Just click on.
just go to the Archives of Appalachia
Yes.
and ask for the interviews that I did, because all the ones from like Baltimore and all those places are in the Archives of Appalachia.
And the ones I did should be at Appalachian State at the Archives of Appalachia there.
That is amazing.
The coolest thing about that project, I was thinking about this, the coolest thing about that project, and Theresa and I talked about this a lot, was that they wanted to tell their stories. Like, they wanted people to know about them. They knew that people talked about them. They knew that people down here in Johnson City and Kingsport would say to their kids, if you don't behave, the Melungeons are going to come and get you,
wow.
right?
Yeah.
And they knew how people had looked at them for years, and they wanted to talk about who they were. And it was such an honor to go up there and be trusted with those stories,
Right.
and
Right.
and to feel like we didn't go with any agenda. We just asked them, what do you want to tell us about
We
the
were
school?
we were
about
getting all that information for them, for their museum,
Right.
and for their archives that they were trying to build. And looking back, and you talked about how they wanted to tell their story. It had been told so much by other people, by outsiders, and been published in journals and papers, and it was that first person interpretation. They wanted to interpret themselves. They wanted to do that. And then when I went to the American Indian Museum, I really got that concept, because that museum is all about the stories of the community, the Native communities, from their own perspective, from their own words. And so here I'd went from this little community who we were already doing that, they were telling your story, and then they were working on their own artifacts and labels and things like that. And then I went to the American Indian Museum, where we had these huge story gathering sessions, and we would bring all those stories back, and the curators would write all this text, and send it back to the community, and they would say yes or no, or we want you to say this instead. And they were finally being able to edit that process, edit those words, say those words, pick their own pictures, pick their own artifacts. And so that's why I really started, getting that, well, people can identify themselves. You identify yourself.
Right.
For the first time, I kind of grasped that concept. So, and it all started there in Vardy.
I
It
think
feels like a microcosm of Appalachia in general.
Yeah.
Because it's like
Yep.
that same story is the story of Appalachia.
Yeah.
Like, people were tired
Yeah.
of people telling the Appalachian narrative to the rest of the world. So I don't know how it's been rectified, but
I think it takes years to rectify it. I think it takes
And concept.
years and multiple projects, and then being reminded. Like, I didn't expect to come and talk about Melungeons today, but I'm so I'm
I
delighted.
know, and things are starting to come back to me. I just remembered Darlene Beveridge, and she did a lot of work in that sort of field as well. And I remember her saying to me one time, Appalachia's never been white enough, or we've never been white enough. But the theory is, or the misconception from, I feel like, the rest of the world is that Appalachian is very homogeneous, very white. And when you hear this Melungeon story, you get a whole nother perspective. And then, what's interesting when I started looking into the Melungeon story, and then started hearing about these Italians that came to Appalachia and built, settlement schools and railroads, and people from all over the world came here and started businesses, and then I go back to what she said, we're not white enough. And I thought, wow, that's really complex. And it's like an onion. You just keep peeling the layers and you can't just take one generalization and say that's how it is. I mean, people have so many different perspectives, and they get those perspectives from their own experiences, that you can't label just one person or one group of people, because they all have their own perspective and their own experiences that have created who they are and who their community is. And I don't know, it's just fascinating to think about. It's too big. It just kind of blows your mind when you start thinking about it.
You were talking earlier about how, in this community, there were squabbles and there was stratification, but it was more like economic and cultural, really, than racial at all.
Yeah.
And in a way, I'm thinking about each of these people as a microcosm for the community in terms of the storytelling, because the people whose stories got poo-pooed in the community still got to tell their story when we went to interview them, right? So the people were like, nah, that's not what happened, or that's not who we are. So everybody got to have a voice, which makes it way more confusing, but makes it way more real.
Yeah.
To me.
Well, that little, not even little, but the microcosm aspect of this community, to me, is a reflection of every group that has ever been othered.
Right.
Yeah.
Because someone else is talking about you who has not even been part of that situation. But to give that group a voice like that, this is who we are. Whatever you're saying out there, because I had heard about this group, and I'm all about love and peace, so I wasn't like the negative, the Melungeon's going to get you, that,
Right.
none of that. But just, who is this population? And this is the most, I could cry, this is the most I've ever heard.
It's a real, the answer to that question is large and beautiful and complicated.
Yeah.
And every other group that has been othered is just as large,
Yes.
beautiful.
And
They got
Appalachians,
that.
I mean, as Theresa was saying, because I'm from Richmond, Virginia, right? And when my former husband told me we were moving out here, I was like, okay, but when your residency's done, we're moving back to civilization, right? And I was here for a year. Well, I was gonna say, I lived here for a year, and he had finished his residency, and he got offered a job in Richmond and a job in Clifton Forge, which is kind of near Lexington, Virginia. Still close enough to Richmond for me, right? And he got offered a job in Johnson City, and he said, "Okay, I've gotten 3 job offers. You choose." And I stayed in Johnson City because by the time I had been here for a year, I already loved the music. I grew up loving the music. When I met the people, you know, I was like, I love this place. And when he and I divorced, I taught at Virginia Commonwealth University. I don't know if I've ever told you this story or not, but I got assigned a class. You have to say the title of this very carefully. Textual analysis. And I got assigned to teach this class for the English department, and it was about analyzing texts. Well, VCU is a big art school, and so everything's a text. A quilt is a text. A song is a text. A cake is a text, right? Oh, wow. And so I'm like, okay, I'm turning this Appalachian. And here I am in urban Richmond with all these people of all different colors. I mean, you talk about a cool place to teach. Like, everybody went to school there. People with all different colors of hair and their pajamas on and tattoos and people looking very mainstream. And so I walk into this classroom and I thought, okay, this first day, hadn't even handed out the syllabus, and I said, everybody get out a piece of paper and a pencil, and I'm going to say a word, and I want you to write down everything that comes to mind when I say this word. And they're like, okay. So they start writing. I'm like, don't pick your pen up, just keep writing. So I stopped them after 2 minutes, and I handed out envelopes, and I said, put your name on the envelope, and they folded up their lists, and they put their names on the envelope, and I put them away. And we took off on a semester of reading The Hawk's Done Gone, of course, and River of Earth, of course, and Serena, and Horace Kephart, and like all of these different things. And I sang to them, and I baked for them, and I took my quilts in, and we looked at photographs. And at the end of the semester, the last day of class, I said, all right, get out a piece of paper, get out a pencil. I'm going to say a word. I want you to write down. I'm sorry, I get emotional when I talk about it. I said, I want you to write down everything you think of when I say this word. And I said Appalachia, and they started writing. And I pulled out the envelopes from the beginning, and I handed them back. And I said, all right, so I'm giving you a take-home exam. And one of the possible questions is to look at your list and to tell me how you got from the first list to the second list. Damn, I got some good answers. I mean, because I think that when you dig deeply in one place, whether that's a little place like Vardy or a big place like, a bigger place, not a big place, but a bigger place like Appalachia, if you dig down deeply in one place, you learn a set of skills that you can pick up and apply wherever you go. And you pick up what you were talking about, that sort of awareness that these are real people with like real stories and real thoughts. And it colors everything else you do, you know. And I mean, those students in Richmond loved that. So we had a great time that semester, and they were so excited. I had 2 art students decide that they were going to do art projects based on, one did coverlets, overshot woven coverlets, and another one did a film. And I mean, I think digging deeply in that one place taught me a lot about a lot of things. A lot of things. I'm really grateful for that experience.
Gosh, guys.
I'm stealing that idea.
Yeah.
Students do that.
It's a great idea.
Yeah, chemistry is the word. And, you know, it'll be very little at the beginning, but
Chemistry is the word.
Yeah.
Oh, I would have, my list would be about this long.
Yeah.
It's like, help.
I've had that answer on an exam before. Just help.
That's great.
Do y'all have any questions for each other?
Yes.
Anything?
Why haven't we done this before?
Well, we did once, and we were talking about this not too long ago. We've done a couple presentations together at different academic conferences, and we were talking about how there was someone who went before us and took much longer than their time, and we were left like this little bit of much time to talk about our work. So it's kind of nice to be able to talk about it again. And
do you guys
tell
have
the
like
stories.
PowerPoints and pictures?
Well, that was before that. This
yeah.
was part of the reason we were panicking, because we had this tape that we had, cassette tape that we had made that had like little snippets of interviews, and you're given 20 minutes, and we had like 10, and we had all these little that you wanted to put, and we had like worked on that. She came and spent the night at my house for like 3 nights, and we sat in my living room floor, and we put this thing together and decided I was so mad.
That was funny.
But you know what it did?
You need to reclaim your time.
It's like learning. It was a learning experience, and when I was the person who was timing things,
Oh yes, yep.
I became the person who said, "Thank you, Michelle. That will be enough. Your time is up."
That person.
And I warned people I was going to do it, but that was I was like, not on my watch.
Right.
Yeah. But now we get to work together through the arts and do very similar things at Create Appalachia and Kingsport, and
Definitely lots of connected things, because we kind of do the business of art at Create Appalachia. So we support people who are entrepreneurial about whatever it is they're doing that's creative. They might be graphic artists or whatever. Our job, game designers, anybody who marries kind of art and technology, it's our job to try to help them get the resources that they need to promote themselves and make a business of it. And we want to incubate them right out of our space, so somebody else can move in and they can set up a business somewhere else in the region, right? And so I explain this by telling people that we're not an arts organization. You're not going to take painting classes in our space, and we're not going to like bring in a ballet troupe or anything like that. We're about the business of art. So it's really been fun now that we've got our center set up, being able to collaborate with other organizations and figure out how we all fit together in this puzzle and how we can collaborate effectively.
I have seen just the world of art grow so much in the past 10 years. And people assume that I'm an artist, and I'm not. I'm a historian, if you couldn't tell by our conversation. But, I was a historian and was always interested in Appalachian art, and then fell into the job at ETSU. I was the director of the Reese Museum, which was under the Appalachian Appalachian Studies Department. And then coming to Jonesborough to be the director of the McKinney Center, where we combine art and story, has been really rewarding. But we are an outlet for you to be creative and for you to learn different medias, and that's in art and storytelling. We gather stories and we do plays, and so we're an outlet for you if you like to be on stage or you want to learn to do that. It's a great place to start out and get your feet wet and to take some classes. And
you have some great exhibits too.
Yeah, we do great exhibits with wonderful artists in the region, and then we do things like this, like Conversations That Matter, that we feel it's important, and that is story based. And I got to tell someone, I just came back from a cruise. I got to do my first cruise and vacation, and I was in Haiti, and I was with my friend and I were doing a paint and sip with a couple from Nashville, and they were African American couple, and the lady was from New York, and they had moved to Nashville, but the husband was from Haiti originally. So we were having these conversations about who are you and what are you doing, and are you enjoying the cruise and that sort of thing. And she said to me, I love going on cruises because everyone, and when she said everyone, she meant people of all colors and all denominations or whatever. She meant all people are in a laid back environment where they're having fun and it doesn't matter, and you're not thinking about all this political stuff and things. And I said to her, I said, well, and I told her that I was the director of an art center in Jonesborough. She said, yeah, I think I've heard of Jonesborough, and I said, well, do you know us as the oldest town in Tennessee, or do you know us as the storytelling capital of the world? and she said storytelling, and I told her about Bob Browning, our town administrator years ago, and when he hired me, story is so important to him, and even in an art center, he wanted to make sure that was part of what we do. And he said, if you know someone's story, and I was telling her this, if you know someone's story, you can't hate them. Mm-hmm. And tears welled up in her eyes. I could see it, and she's like, oh, I love that. Oh, I'm going to come to Jonesborough. And I was like, yeah, so that's what it is. That's what it's about. And I think that's why a lot of us in the nonprofit world do what we do, because we want to have that connection with people, and we want them to tell we want them to feel validated. Because when you're in a nonprofit, you're usually working for an underdog somewhere, right? Whether it's an animal or whether it's people or whatever, and so you want to validate them. And it kind of goes back to like your story of what you do, the project you did with your students. So when I was in 7th grade, the first museum I ever remember going to was the Reese Museum on the campus of East Tennessee University. And they had a quilt exhibit. And I walk in and I remember thinking to myself, well, my mama has quilts like this. And I remember thinking, oh, maybe her quilts are important too. And realizing for the first time that where I came from was important.
Oh.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to make sure that kids in this area realize that what they are and who they are and where they're from is just as valid as anywhere else.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
I felt that way when I was teaching at Tusculum too, because kids would come to me, and Tusculum had a lot of students from like Florida and New Jersey and other places, and people from around here would say, oh, well, I'm just from here. And I'm like, do you know that people come from other countries to like be here and study the culture? And when I started learning more about the language, my biggest fun was telling people there is nothing wrong with the way you talk.
Yep.
It's got a long, beautiful history, and you should be proud of it.
And I had a high school teacher tell me I needed to lose my accent. I remember being at Berea College and being in a class where a professor made a comment about our accents and how if we were going to be successful, we need to lose it. And I remember at the Smithsonian, where I worked with a lot of different types of people, George Horsecapture was a curator there. And he was an elder. He was someone that everyone respected. And so, you're just sort of in awe when he walks into the room. And as a young 20-year-old, that's how I felt when he walked into the room. It was just like, his knowledge, he just had all this knowledge. And I was sitting in a library kind of area with maps, and he comes in, and it was just the two of us in the room, and he said, now, where are you from? And I said, Virginia, Southwest Virginia. And he said, West Virginia? I said, no, Southwest Virginia. And he said, you listen to NPR, don't you? And I said, well, sometimes. And I said, what do you? I said, he said, because that's where they play the hillbilly music. And it was like, this is so funny. I have an Indian calling me a hillbilly. It's hilarious. I just thought, how funny is this, right? And then I worked with another curator, Paul Chat Smith, and he's Comanche, and he called me a cracker for the first time. And I just loved it. I thought, are you serious? And it was all in fun. Like, he wasn't being mean or anything. It was just, and we were working on this project where we had this wall of guns to demonstrate sort of genocide and the
that was appropriate in that.
That was appropriate in that. And we were looking for all types of guns from the earliest, rifle to AR-15s, and he gave examples of different wars and battles and that these guns were used in. And so one of my jobs was to contact the NRA because they have a museum and to get guns. And I was having a really hard time getting in touch with them. And I asked Paul one day, I was like, why are you making me do this? And he said, because they're your people. Oh. I was like, what? He's like, you can talk to them. You know, you're from the South and y'all use guns. And so, you know, here I am. I mean, it was like a turnaround. But again, it was not in hate or violence or anything like it. It was very funny. And we got all the guns we needed from the NRA eventually. I got them for the exhibit. So, yeah, fun times. But just realizing who you are and where you're from, and I think people do need to feel that they belong.
Yeah.
And I think that's why the Melungeon, kind of back to the Melungeon thing, I think that's why people find it so fascinating, and some people want to know because they run into that roadblock. I did a lot of genealogy when I was at Appalachian State as a grad student, and there were some genealogy type classes, and every once in a while I would, because I was sort of into the triracial group thing and looking at different communities in the Southeast, the archivist would send African American students to me and say maybe she can help you find where you need to go. And it was really hard for me sometimes to watch these young people hit that block and not be able to go any further.
Right.
You know, and it made me realize how lucky I was, because I can trace my family back to, 15 generations back to Scotland and Ireland and England, and they wanted to know where they were from and who they're from, and so I think we all sort of have that in us, and we want to be validated and we want to feel important, and I think we need to remember that when we interact with people in the day.
And I think it's important to know that those folks who can't find where they're from are stuck with what they've been told. So, like, I think back, every kid's asked at the very beginning of the school year, tell us your ancestry, where you're from. I'm from Scotland, I'm from Ireland, I'm from Germany, I'm from slaves. That's all. Now, I find, luckily for me, I can go all the way back to the slave ship, thanks to DNA and a cousin who's all about it. But so it goes back to a slave ship, right?
But
now,
no further.
Yeah, and I can look at my DNA ancestry stuff, and it will tell me countries of Africa now, but I didn't have that back then.
Right.
And it goes back to what's your story and how much of your own story do you know, which is important. I would love for the Melungeon folks to know it's Spanish, it's African American, it's Native American, it's Caribbean. Where is it from? Where is it from? For that, just for the sole purpose of knowing this is who I am, 100%.
And I think the DNA was supposed to answer that, but what it did was it sort of confirmed what the rest of us thought, and that is that community became they became a community because they were choosing that community and creating that community. Like, they didn't really care as much about where they were from, because some of them were trying to get away from where they were from,
and they were trying to survive.
And
And when I did some oral histories in Western North Carolina too, and we interviewed white families and black families, and what we got from that project was that things were based more on gender issues, or what gender you were determined your roles rather than what race you were. And we've heard stories, story after story of, a black family and a white family would trade labor. Maybe one had a truck and one had the produce, and they would borrow the truck to take it to market and things like that. So communities in Appalachia had to survive. I think that created, it created a lot of different scenarios. I don't think people, I don't want to say that they didn't look at race. Of course they did, because it was the day and time. But they had to survive. And so I think they did what they needed to do to get by.
they had a much more highly developed sense of the interconnectedness of people in a community. I mean, that goes back to kind of what we were talking about earlier that people had their job that they made a living doing, but then they also had a job that served the community. Like there were certain women who would go and wash the body when somebody passed away, or there were people who would go and assist the midwife, and it didn't matter what color you were, she was going to come and do that for you. So
I think you still find that today.
Yeah.
I mean, people work for, their 9 to 5 job or 8 to 5 job, but there's one person that you go to shoe your horses, or there's one person that you go to fix your tractor, because in Lee County there's not a lot of industry and business. You're not going to find a Holland farm store or Ford farm store. You're going to go down this road and turn left at the big oak tree and at the red mailbox you're going to ask so and so to fix your truck. I mean, so that's sort of they survive. That's how they keep going.
And they just make stuff up as they go along, and they need it. Like I watch my husband. It's so funny. I told him I married him because he's my Appalachian street cred or mountain cred. But he grew up in Russell County, which is over there near where Theresa's from. And I remember one time we had made this big pile of compost, and there were big chunks in it, and I wanted that nice fluffy compost to put them. And so I went inside and I was searching for like compost things to sift compost, and I was in there about half an hour, and I walked out in the backyard and he was sifting compost, and I was like, "What'd you do?" And he said, "Well, I just made one." He just got some hardware cloth and some, but Theresa knows him. And he was like, "Don't go to Lowe's. We don't need that. I got some scraps of wood. I got a scrap of hardware cloth. We can make this happen." And it's that, one of the things that I tell people all the time about Appalachia, and I said this when I was working on the Smithsonian Folk Life Festival back when I did that, we were sitting around talking about characteristics of Appalachian culture, and one of them is that they're innovative.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, they can make something out of nothing, and it'll be a beautiful, functional something.
Yep.
And, people don't think about Appalachians as being creative and innovative, but they are.
Absolutely.
I think I landed in just the right job because, like, all the things that I've been doing and learning have plunked me down in a space where I can showcase that about the region, and to have conversations like this that, people like you who've wondered about Melungeons can
get that information.
And
more.
Yeah. And it's kind of fun for us to be able to tell because now we have Melungeon stories, right? Yeah. Right? So we get to tell our stories, so thank you for that.
Yeah.
It's amazing. Guys.
Thank y'all so much for joining us today.
Fabulous.
We often say this, but I really mean it this time. We're going to have a part 2.
Oh,
I'm sure there's much more.
Oh my goodness.
I know. I've got a couple Melungeon stories I want to tell you guys. So
oh gosh, yeah.
We'll have to have a part 2.
We're going to have part 2.
Exactly. I mean, amazing.
I'm just thinking back about all these lovely people that I met and the funny stuff I learned and the
humor
stuff that just blows your mind and rips your heart out. And
again, preparing for this, I know we got to go, but preparing for this, I was thinking about all the things that we talked to people about in Vardy and how self-sustaining they were.
Oh, yeah.
And when you think about that community, but Appalachian communities, they were the source of everything. We have a TV now, we have our iPhones now. They had nothing like that. They had to grow their own food. They were their own grocery store. They had to provide their own entertainment. They had to provide their own bedding. They had to provide every single thing for themselves. They milked their cows. They did everything. But when you look at the collections in the museum, because I'm a museum person, since I was 17, I worked in museums. And when you look at early banjos, early fiddles, early quilts, they're meticulously beautiful and crafted. So these people who were surviving, or who stereotypically we see as primitive, or we think were primitive, they were masters at their craft. They were masters at living. They were masters at it because they lived and thrived.
Yep.
And so was Vardy. I mean, Vardy was a thriving little community.
Wow. Fabulous, guys. Which makes me think about my
What a
grandfather.
great way to spend an afternoon.
Yes, let's do this again. This has been great.
You have to.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. That's the end of our show for